Given he'd wanted a romantic evening watching the fireworks, bailing on his date 5 minutes before midnight wasn't the smartest move. But no one had ever blamed or praised Draven for using his head over his heart. He stumbled, tripping over his own feet in his haste to get up the hill to the castle. Running was not in his skill set, but he couldn't miss the fireworks. Galdorsfarne only had magic like this on show a couple of times a year. He cast a quickening charm on his feet. It was a little wasteful, and on any other day probably would have earned him a lecture about responsible magic use, but there was no one around to see. Maybe next year would be the one where he started making plans actually involving planning. The letter he'd received that morning held the promise that, starting on Monday, he would finally be where he wanted to be. Draven crested the hill with a whole 30 seconds to spare, leaning back against the cold, crumbling ruins as he tried to catch his breath. Before he had totally recovered, the sky exploded. The first rocket burst into a shower of purple, and he felt that giddy rush he'd always felt as a child. The light scattered into tiny blue sparks, which danced through the sky, forming huge, rolling waves. A series of smaller silver fireworks burst behind them, giving the waves their crests, before the blue faded and the silver began cycling through all the colours of the rainbow. It felt perfect to watch the display alone, and to do so from one of his favourite places. He had always loved the castle ruins. They stretched into a past so far and distant, so different to the reality he lived in, that it might easily have been a different world. Draven exhaled, his breath forming clouds in front of his face, which joined the smoke streaking through the sky after the first fireworks. The whole community of Galdorsfarne was on the lawn below the castle, stretched on picnic rugs and wrapped in jackets lined with warming charms. Kids ran around with batons, letting off little puffs of coloured smoke and sparks, not taking anywhere near enough care where they pointed something that was full of tiny explosives. Given the world only contained a few hundred people, it was easy enough to gather them together. Somewhere down there was the guy he'd been on a date with, until Draven had bailed in favour of the castle ruins. There hadn't been anything wrong, exactly. Perfectly nice guy, but that was it. Just nice. No spark. Draven had decided he'd prefer to spend midnight imagining someone perfect, rather than kissing someone who wasn't. He smiled at the scene, enjoying it from a distance. People were happy. New Year was always such an exciting holiday, so full of promise. Silver comet fireworks streaked through the air, whistling and leaving glittering tails.